think that film is such a powerful art form for three reasons. First, it's a collective space, and people can really think about how their culture, whatever that culture is, you can be in Sudan, you can be in India, you can be in China, Brazil, Russia. It gives people a sense of mythology that is in real space in real time, and that's different than a book. A book is subjective. You're sitting there alone reading a book, for example, and that's been centuries of literary developments. But film is about everyone sharing a very specific relationship to those moving images. Then the second thing is sound is very powerful. But if you go back to the beginning of silent film, people would tell the story with the body language. So there's a way that dance and choreography go into storytelling as well. And I find that those two variables put into juxtaposition generates a third, which is how people respond to potential. Most people, when they see a film, whatever that style or genre or whatever, they're left with a sense of how it relates to their own personal life. And I've tended to find over the years, I'm an artist who does remixing. My view of what is quote unquote original narrative or original footage or this or that is that it's about transformation and change. There's not a scene I can look at in a film and not think, how would I remix that? But everyone does. And I think that you're going to be seeing more and more over the next several decades as more people build a digital media literacy, that you'll be seeing this notion of a more democratic and mobile version of how everyone wants to see different versions of a film on their phone, on their tablet, things like that. And that's a healthy sign of media literacy. So that's why I think film is so powerful. A film experience that changed my life was absolutely growing up in Washington, D.C. And the Smithsonian was nearby, and they have the Air and Space Museum, which when I was a kid had some of the largest screens going in the world. And you could go see some of the space shuttle launches, and like if there was a rocket or something going on, you could there to have it on the Smithsonian's. It's a huge screen, like a city block long, and seeing that kind of early Washington, D.C., like I'd walk from DuPont Circle where I was growing up down to where all the museums were, and you'd go into the Air and Space Museum, and you see all these airplanes and satellites and rockets and stuff hanging from the ceiling. It's a beautiful museum. And then go into this crazy theater that had this epic scale screen, and then see the space shuttle, just like, wow. And when you're a kid and you see that sense of like scale, it really changes your sense of how film works. Now, amusingly enough, most of my work is now on tablets and cell phones and so on. But that early idea of scale, especially with that particular screen and that particular museum, really changed the way I think about the moving image. I think of many of my influences come from the idea of sampling and collage. So DJ culture, remix sampling, video editing. So say, for example, the Italian futurist, Luigi Russolo, he wrote this book, The Art of Noise, in 1915. Now, strangely and amusingly enough, that's the same year that D.W. Griffith has his film Birth of a Nation come out. So Art of Noise, Birth of a Nation, those are big seminal influences on my work and thinking about narrative. Then on the other end of the spectrum, I'm a big fan of the idea of magic and poetry applied to cinema. So I'm a huge fan of two other filmmakers, Jean Cocteau and Orson Welles. With my favorite film from Welles is F for Fake, or from Jean Cocteau, The Blood of a Poet, Le Sang d'un Poète, for the French. Both of whom were able to think about magic and narrative in a clever way, that thinking about how editing would break apart linearity. Like, so Jean Cocteau, all his films are kind of cinema poems. And then from tech and other kind of more contemporary stuff, I'm a big fan of Sir Tim Berners-Lee, the gentleman who invented the web as we know it. And I'm also a fan of the political activism and philosophy of people like Angela Davis, who's an old family friend. For me, political activism and human rights and women's rights, gay rights, whatever rights about the dignity of the human being are critical to how I think film, art, and literature can, respond to some. These are very dark and cynical times. So, but meanwhile, we can actually have a lot more enlightenment, and I think that's where some of the references I was talking about. Then from the actual craft of film, probably hands down my biggest influence is Stanley Kubrick, because he had a kind of very powerful way of conveying narrative but still leaving you with so many different kind of dynamics in place. I mean, if you look at 2001: A Space Odyssey and compare that to Doctor Strangelove, or Doctor Strangelove, then compare that to any of stuff around Vietnam or some of the other stuff he was working on, there's this intensity. That's what makes his films, but it's a lyrical intensity. It's not just like explosions or science fiction aliens or something, but it's just brilliant. I would love for people to think of the term complexity, just one word. There's a lot to be unpacked in that one word, and the way that it's not just music, it's not just film, it's not just even being in that room, but about the nested layers of things that go on. Even if you're in the room, you can watch material from your phone or your tablet or download, upload, remix, transform. All of that, it's hard to say that there's one, but except for the complexity of the layers and interaction. So for me, that's the word. I'd say one of my favorite projects, more for fun, it was collecting old Jamaican 45 vinyl, and we did a project called with Trojan Records, which is a legendary Jamaican record label, and I love early vinyl 45 from Jamaica and the Caribbean. It was called Rhythm Come Forward, and it was all very rare archival materials from the archives of Trojan Records, and it was incredible to go and visit some of their offices and warehouses and look at the history of dub and early Jamaican music on electronic music. And yeah, I can only imagine, I go to Jamaica a lot, but it was really fun doing that project. And I have many projects, but particularly there's something that's playfully irreverent about reggae and dub and stuff like that. That's still political, but the way they use the studio, like Lee Scratch Perry, was a legendary influence on my work, and so on. So yeah, the Trojan Records project. The reason I engage topics and themes in my work that I think are associated with sampling and collage, political activism, human rights, social justice issues, but also I'd say a key and critical component that comes out of my own history is my father's relationship to human rights and legal issues. He was dean of Howard University's law school, and my mom was a kind of a feminist historian of design. And so thinking about the way objects can influence your everyday life. She would, she had a store called Toast and Strawberries that was at DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C. That was one of the first black-owned small businesses in D.C. owned by a woman that was really a cultural hub for the avant-garde culture, again, very multicultural. And I grew up in a household of, I guess, political discourse and thinking about the consequences of objects, the consequences of elections, the consequences of if someone's human rights are denied or things like that. So that, I think, overshadows a lot of my work. And I'm just very thankful to both my parents for giving me a sense that things don't need to be the way they are, and everything can be changed. A lot of, I think, the material and media and the way we live right now, there's a fatalism, and there's a sense that, climate change or political narrative of whatever administration God, is put on this planet, everything, there's a study recently that shows something like 3.5% of the population can actually cause a revolution. You don't need 100%, you don't need 50% or 60%, but just 3.5% of whatever nation state's population really wants to change stuff, they can do it. So I like to think that I contribute to this idea of change with my work. I think it's incredibly important. First, if you're studying to be a filmmaker or a composer, to be able to have access to a real movie theater that is highly equipped, and you guys have, incredible selection of tools available to the students. And then on top of that, to have the real world experience of having work presented, and, you learn from the mistakes and learn from seeing the nuts and bolts of how any machinery gets put together. If you give people those tools at an early phase in their life or in their career, it gives them much better tools to engage when they get out of the school. I'm a quirky wild card here because I didn't study film. but I have a hobbyist kind of approach, which means it's uneven, wildly uneven. I mean, I might know about some cameras, I might know about some software, but I don't have a full array of knowing of all the different things going on. So the hobbyist or amateur approach is my take on things. But what you guys are doing is giving people a platform to be able to explore a wide spectrum of all of the tools and things available. And that's, really refreshing to see. You aren't in the middle of Hollywood. You're not in the middle of New York. You're in the middle of Bloomington. I mean, and and that gives people some breathing room, So that's really refreshing to see.